Before we start today's episode, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the awful tragedy and hate crime that took place in Atlanta recently. We want to extend our condolences and support to the families of the victims and the Asian and Asian American communities. Racism of any kind is unacceptable, and we can't ignore the rise in anti Asian sentiment since the pandemic that's led to racist attacks, such as the shooting in Atlanta. Resources for education and support will be listed in the description box of this episode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the In League podcast, powered by She Scores. I'm your co-host, Kat Pitré.
And I'm John, back as always. So for today's episode, well, first let me say it has been a wild cat since
It's been
a,
a minute.
a week feels like a long time. You missed one episode, it feels like 2 weeks. So to our fans, we apologize that we didn't make it to you guys last week, but we're back this week.
We
And
took
to
a
kick
little
off this
vacation.
show, say that again.
So we took a little vacation.
Yeah, just a short one, but we're back. It is March Madness, exciting time in the basketball world. This is, last year in 2020, due to COVID, there was not a March Madness tournament. And this year, fortunately, we are able to have the men's and women's tournaments this year, which is really exciting stuff. But I think the first thing that we obviously have to talk about, Kat, is the events that have literally took social media by storm. Over the course of the weekend when the initial round of 64 of the
Mhm.
NCAA tournaments happened, there was pictures that surfaced on the internet, and it showed a clear, clear discrepancy between the resources given to the men's athletes in the tournament compared to the women's athletes in the tournament. And luckily for you know, the courage of the women speaking out about the lack of competence that was brought their way, um, the world was able to see that discrepancy and and it has been a wildfire of influence by major professional athletes, former athletes, people in media, just fans of the sport in general, calling out the NCAA, making statements, and it has just been a bit of a debacle to say the least.
Yes, it's been actual madness.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been crazy. So for anyone who doesn't know what's been going on with the NCAA, I don't know how. You might not know because it's been on every single social media platform for the last week. But essentially what happened was that the NCAA, well, it really started with weight rooms. The women's weight rooms were not equitable to the men's weight rooms, and one of the NCAA players went on Twitter, I believe, in a video and was just kind of like, "Hey, what's up with this? This isn't fair." And then some other things came out about like the swag bags not being of equal value and some pictures circulating that showed that they definitely were not the same. And same thing with like meal options and dining options. So now the NCAA vice president for basketball, Dan Gavitt, has apologized. He apologized on Friday about the disparity in facilities and resources designated for the men's and women's tournaments. And he, to his credit, he was like, "Hey, we dropped the ball on this, but also the ball should have never been
Not to
dropped."
begin with, exactly.
Yeah, and that's kind of the big thing for me has been this is a continuing story, and I just had a conversation with someone today earlier about it where there's so much outrage about it, but for women's players and fans of women's sports and female athletes, this is not a new situation and it's not a new conversation. And this is something the act of devaluing and lack of resources and support granted to women's sport programs, especially in the NCAA. I mean, this is not a new situation. It's just that it's become so public.
Yeah, I agree. I think I was just, 100% agree with that because I was just gonna say, like, if the pictures and the images came out, like, this has happened before. Like, this isn't the first time this has probably have happened, something like this. And I think the one thing that annoys me, and like you said, Dan Gavitt definitely acknowledged that they dropped the ball, but we both agree, like, that shouldn't have never happened in the first place. As somebody who played in the NCAA, played at the Division I level, there is so much money in the NCAA. There is not a lack thereof finances that the NCAA has. I mean, this is the entity that runs all of collegiate sports in the United States of America, from Division One all the way down to Division Three,
Mhm.
between TV contracts, endorsements, sponsorships, the money's brought in by the schools. This is flat out inexcusable. I think the one thing that also was bad is like the initial excuse as well was there was not enough space to accommodate the needs of the women's tournament. And then when the viral video came out of what their actual weight room looked like, it showed that there was more than enough space. Um, I totally feel like this is disrespectful. You
Yeah.
know, I can't try to like be politically correct about it because there is nothing to really be politically correct about. Like this was just a flat out disrespect to all the women who have worked just as hard as the men in NCAA collegiate basketball to get to this point. Not only
Mhm.
that, like, are we not going to acknowledge like this is the biggest tournament in men's and women's basketball in the country? You play Not everybody goes and plays professional basketball. So you play your entire basketball career for this moment. And then
Right.
when you go on the internet and see that the resources the men got is absurd, and then the ones you got is almost like laughable. Like when you see, it looks like you got the women get a box of just food that was like already prepared, but it looked like it just got warmed up in a microwave and sent to them, while the men are literally in a buffet style uh, dining arrangement. These things are not just dropping the ball. Like you thought this through.
Right.
No, there was a this was your plan of action. So when I guess you look at all the figureheads who organized this bubble for the collegiate players, there was agreements that were made. Like we're going to agree that the women are only going to get some free weights and yoga mats. Their bag is only going to have a certain amount of things, and then the men, we're going to give them 5 deodorant sticks, 5 sanitizer wipes, abundance of shirts, all the toiletries and shirts and materials that they need, but the women do not get that same luxury. So that's why I just feel like, yes, you apologize, you do your due diligence, but you didn't have no respect to begin with. And shout out to social media, shout out to the fans who spoke up and just brought light to this. Shout out to the Oregon basketball player. I can't think of her name in the moment. But who posted the video, like straight up posted the video, like, look at this, like, do this even make sense?
Mhm.
Um, and I just feel like overall, to like just tie up my point, is not only is it disrespectful and a lack of competence, it just shows that even in 2021, people still can't read the room.
Right.
Like you still can't read the room between
Yeah.
everything that has happened in the last, I guess, 2 years since COVID has started, between George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, um, the countless. Uh, there's been so many social inequalities brought to light over the last 2 years, and for you to show a level of inequality, a level of just not being, like I said, not being able to read a room. It's just beyond me. Um, and I just think NCAA, they got to do a whole lot better. Like that was just flat out ridiculous.
Yeah. I think dropping the ball doesn't actually encompass it because you're right, like, they planned this out. This was a series of decisions that they made, and a good example of this is one of the excuses, and I use that word deliberately here, that the NCAA put out about, like, the training options that the women's team had. They were like, "Oh, well, we plan to have more ahead of round 16, but it just wasn't done yet." And I'm like, "Okay, well, that's, like, first of all, a terrible excuse. Second of all, like, it should have been done already. You shouldn't be waiting this far." I'm like, that doesn't make you look any better because what this really is showing is a repeated pattern of behavior where you are devaluing the women's side of the NCAA tournament. You're not investing in it fully, even though, again, and we say this all the time, the viewership is there, the revenue is there, and it is being generated. So why aren't governing bodies really understanding that and kind of taking notice. And it comes with little things. Somebody brought up to me today how the logo on the courts are different.
Yep.
And the men's is like this huge March
Yeah.
Madness, NCAA. I mean, March Madness, I mean, it's huge. If you're not a basketball fan, like I can't say this enough. Like March Madness is ginormous. I mean, it's huge.
Huge.
And I think on the women's side, it just says women's basketball and like NCAA, like even those little tiny markers, they all coalesce into one big situation. Like everything means something. And so when you have all of these little things like the swag bags and the dining options and the logos and what players are given, it it shows how devalued women's sports are by the governing bodies that are meant to support them and
I
give them the
agree.
resources to succeed.
I agree. And I think another thing too is it's like we've taken this incident shows how many steps back we still taking. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
You know, you and I on this podcast talk a lot about how can we advance as a society, advance the women's game in sports. And I think one thing you and I have both agreed on, and we preach this, is we got to stop separating men and women in terms of like their athleticism or how we value them as athletes. You know,
Mhm.
it is just the NCAA March Madness. It's not should just say women's basketball in the center of the basketball court. We keep doing this division, and that's where I feel like we that's the thing that we gotta like get out of our head the most. We talk about like viewership and equal pay, things that we know is going to take time. But things like having just flat out respect for the athletes and the work that they do and how we value them and acknowledge them as athletes, that can be fixed right away.
Oh,
We
yeah.
like you said, your governing bodies are the example set. They set the example of how, the product is viewed, how the NCAA is viewed. You can change your perspectives. You can value the women's game just as much as you value the men's game. Let's not act like women's collegiate basketball is not bringing in money for the NCAA. Like, let's not be blind and say that uh, men's football, and men's basketball bring in majority of the money for the NCAA. Because I would say behind those two, women's basketball is the third biggest. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't understand how we still taking steps back. And then all the media and movements about, getting rid of the female and the female athlete, getting rid of the girl hooper, just the hooper in women's sports. That's what we've been trying to do this whole time. And the NCAA still showing that we living in a world where y'all the girls, so y'all play like this. These the boys, they need a little bit more attention.
Right.
But everybody going in the same gym for 12 hours, putting in the same work,
Mhm.
getting the same 1,000 shots as the other guy across the way. But we still taking these type of step backs. And it's disappointing. It's like really
Yeah.
like, it's just overall like, it just feels like we like deprogressing. I don't know if that's the
Yeah.
right word. Regressing, my bad. Regressing.
Regressing.
I know
No.
the word,
Yeah. And I mean, it's disappointing, I think, because we expected better of the NCAA. I think we all expected more from them. And you hear what some of the coaches have been saying about the NCAA, and they're disappointed too because I think we all expected better. And, again, we preach solutions on this podcast. That's a big thing for us. And one of the things, so Dawn Staley, basketball legend, she's also the coach of South Carolina.
Mhm.
She was talking about in an interview recently how just from the beginning when the NCAA was kind of developing, okay, how are we going to have these March Madness tournaments? What are we going to do? The tournaments for the men's and women's were kind of like designed separately
Mhm.
almost. And she was saying, okay, if you're really committed, right, to basketball, you are going to develop these tournaments at the same time. You're going to put the same amount of time and effort and energy and resources and money into it, right? Because that makes sense. And
Mhm.
and that didn't happen. And so it's things like that where the pressure is really on the NCAA to, you're absolutely right, set that narrative and set that tone, but also you just need to treat those programs the same. And we see a lot in NCAA, but outside of it too, women's sports programs, even in like elementary school,
Yeah.
really lower levels, they don't receive the same support and resources financially or socially. And it creates this huge disparity that extends, that we see all the way up into the NCAA.
Yeah.
And it's disappointing because it shouldn't be happening. And it is, and really obviously. And I think too, something that stood out to me was the fact that the disparities were so obvious.
Yeah.
And I'm like, did you not think anyone was gonna say anything about it?
Right.
You think the players are just gonna keep silent? The coaches aren't gonna say anything about it? And that's what gets me. I'm like, did you not realize what this actually means?
It's like a level of arrogance that
Yeah.
don't make sense. It's a level of arrogance that don't make sense. Um, and then as somebody who's played in like bowl games and received all types of gifts from the behalf of the sponsors that work with the NCAA, it's like, how did like the workers and stuff, like when they were packaging up this food or setting up the weight room, I know there had to be the workers looking like, no, there's no way like this is what we're doing. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
I think everybody was probably, there was a level of dumbfoundedness I am willing to bet my last dollar on by like the people even having to set that up because it don't even look right. Like imagine putting somebody in a bubble and you make it to the end. So remember, there's going to be teams like that don't play till next weekend. So they're going to have to
Mhm.
be in that space for weeks. Thankfully, organizations like Dick's Sporting Goods, Orange Theory Fitness intervene. Intervene thanks to, obviously the cries of the people
Mhm.
and it gave some of these resources out. But I think another thing too, I think this moment sheds light on this probably happens in other big sporting events in NCAA championships. And I think by that one player at the University of Oregon, when she showed what was going on, that's motivation for the next athlete when they're having the cross country national championship or the softball. I don't know if it's the World Series or like whatever that. I forgot. I don't know if the women's do a tournament or they do a World Series, but the College World Series for men's and softball, it's not going to look the same if the accommodations aren't right. They're going to do the same thing. So at least one thing that is for sure certain is a tone was set. You know
Mhm.
what I'm saying? And I don't think a slip up like this is going to happen again. You know what I'm saying? So like I think it was one of those things where you can't you're sickened by the fact that it happened, but now the fact that it happened, there's very less likely chance that it'll ever happen again because
Right.
of the repercussions of it happening the first time.
Yeah. And so as someone, you've played in the NCAA, you've kind of, and you have a lot of experience within basketball just on the side of covering it, right, for sports media. Where do you think the NCAA can improve from here, right? Because this is a pretty low bar, but we also expected a lot more from them.
Um, so I think the NCAA could improve in a lot of ways, but the thing
Yeah.
is, the NCAA then had so many flaws. Is that it's just like for a long time, like we just started addressing players' right to compensation. You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? We got these universities and the NCAA making millions of dollars off the backs of athletes, not really caring all the time about some of the things that are needed, but
Mhm.
making all this money. I think, the NCAA is really willing to suck the blood dry of its athletes. I mean, it is that simple. Um, in terms of improvement, it is just time to listen to the players. I
Right.
mean, at some point, I think the NCAA players, should have been a union of the NCAA players. At least when I was in, I would have loved for, there to be some sort of players union where all the athletes from every type of sport can fill out some sort of survey or, questionnaire about things that are needed. The
Mhm.
NCAA wants to improve, they gotta listen to the people that is making them all this money. Because at
Right.
some point, there's going to come a time, Cat, and I don't know when, but it will come when the NCAA is going to fumble in such a major way if they don't change. And some of these players are going to strike.
Yeah.
And it's going to be for the right reason. Like, once the reason is motivating enough where the players like, all right, we starting to realize like y'all can't this NCAA don't go on with or without us. There's no
Mhm.
games if none of us decide to play. Coaches don't make money. Because at some point that's what's gonna happen. These collegiate players are gonna just start taking matters into their own hand and starting to realize that they got some power in this. I know
Mhm.
most people are gonna be listening to this and thinking, you know, you're you're a student athlete that is getting a free ride to a university and you should be grateful and not be able and not say so many things. I've heard this before.
Mhm.
But that's not the only thing that is about just getting a free education. The same way I'm using the university as this device to give me this education, you are using me, the athlete, to make more money for this giant engine you call the NCAA. You're using me, and I'm not talking about me specifically, just athletes using the TV deals to pack your stadiums, talking to the universities. So there is a bit of power that these athletes have because they're not coming to just like, they're not coming to just see the school. They're coming to see the players. They're coming to see the talent. So if the NCAA, to answer your question in the simplest terms, if the NCAA wants to improve or be better, they got to start listening to the players. If that means sending out a every 3 to 4 months, sending out a questionnaire or something to fill out, whatever it is, start a players union, a players representations group, like a leadership group where there's a bunch of representatives of athletes. But it got to be something that is a direct line or direct voice for the athletes in the NCAA.
Mhm.
Because ultimately, what happened at the women's March Madness tournament is just a damn shame.
Yeah.
That is a damn shame. And the fact that we even have to say that the NCAA needs to listen more to their athletes, I feel like that says enough in itself.
Right. No, I agree. And I think another place where they could improve is oversight. Who's checking the NCAA? Players can't. They don't have that power. And so it really falls on the internal dialogue of the NCAA to make sure that they are, you're absolutely right, listening to the players, but also standardizing their resources
Yeah.
and the support that they give um, across the board. I think something that stood out to me when kind of researching this and watching all of this unfold on social media was again like the coach's position. And I mean, I think everybody knows Geno at UConn, but he
The
he
GOAT.
had some
The
things to
GOAT.
say. Oh my god, incredible! But he said, we're really lucky here at UConn. We have a great history. I mean, like 11 national championships will do that, right? But that's not equal across the board. Some schools have incredible support given to their female athletes. It's equitable or as close as they can get it right now, but that's not the standard. And so the NCAA really needs to step up in that respect as well and make sure, okay, all of these schools are receiving the same support as
Yeah.
these and making sure that there's oversight in making and understanding that and making sure that gets done.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like with big governing bodies, and you can look at the NCAA like this, but you can also look at places like USA Hockey, whoever,
Mhm.
and it feels like you're speaking into the void because you're like, "Hello, here's a problem.
Right.
What are you doing about it?" And I don't know if we're seeing anything proactive. I feel like everything that's been coming out is the NCAA saying, "Oh, oops,
Yeah.
sorry, like we'll fix it." But these are problems that have been in that institutional structure for decades. We shouldn't be reacting to those problems anymore. We should be solving them. And in
Yeah.
any case, they should have been solved like forever ago. But so my question to NCAA, hey, what are you doing to solve these problems? Because we still have them.
You know, it's real ironic, Kat. You know what the NCAA does every time a season ends for a period of athletes? They give us like this sheet of just things to talk about from your coaching staff to your experience. So I already know that for at least 3 to 4 years, I was filling those out. Nobody's read one of my,
Nobody's
or
read
even
them.
if they do read them, they don't actually take them and do anything with them. So like
Mhm.
I know for sure players have been talking about these issues or some of the discrepancies they have for a while. It's just when is somebody going to decide to answer? Um, Unfortunately, I have the lovely opportunity to have went to UConn. And ultimately, I am also in a relationship with a UConn Husky, and I will tell you the thing about the women's basketball team compared to like the other women's programs in NCAA basketball is UConn's women's basketball, they get a lot of donors because they win
Mhm.
so much. When you're that much of a powerhouse, you know, they are kind of like the foundation of like UConn basketball in Connecticut. So like
Mhm.
Geno and company knows like we're always going to be good because even if the NCAA doesn't want to pour much money into us, our donors are going to give us a few $100,000, if not more, to get through a season. But I think you said it best. Everybody don't have that luxury, and I feel like I feel like I'm like repeating myself. But the NCAA ultimately, you you got to just find a way to make everything on the same playing field.
Right.
And you got to also understand too, like some of these athletes, like just because you play Division 1 in a sport don't mean you on a full scholarship. Only like basketball, football, and like women's basketball have like enough scholarships to fill an entire roster. Other sports do not have enough athletic scholarships like soccer, baseball, softball, field hockey, lacrosse, even track. Like those sports don't even have enough scholarships to please get all their athletes through. I think that's something the NCAA can fix.
Mhm.
You can you're gonna make more than enough money for a lot of these from a lot of these athletes. You can at least pick up the rest of the tab on a lot of these tuition bills. You know what I'm saying? Like you bringing in billions and trillions of dollars every year. You have the compensation to help. Um, and it's just time to like overall just we gotta be equal in how we represent these games. Like it
Mhm.
gotta be everything just needs to be on an equal playing field. Um,
Right. And there's something I want to bring up. We are winding down our conversation on the NCAA, but I want to bring up something that has happened in basketball recently, that kind of shows this same association that we saw with the March Madness tournaments in the NCAA of this devaluing of women's sports and not really recognizing um, the athletic ability is equal. Did you or have you heard about Shaquille O'Neal's comments
oh, about
on
lowering the rim.
NBA on TNT?
About
Yes.
lowering the rim. He asked Candace Parker about lowering the rim.
Yeah, Candace Parker, two-time WNBA MVP, incredible, incredible athlete.
NBA champion as well.
Yeah, she was not having it. She was not having it. What
Yeah.
did you think about that whole situation?
I've talked about this with a few different people, and some people are trying to say, like, Shaq wasn't coming from a place of malice. I don't think he was. And maybe if he maybe he wasn't, but don't ask that question. Like, what type like that's the condescending rhetoric that we've been talking about for a long time. Like, stop dividing everything. The hoop don't need to be lowered because you just want to see more dunks.
Yeah. People are dunking, by the way.
Like I can't think of her name, but that young lady that plays in Stanford, she dunks on fast breaks all the time on the
Yeah.
same rim as the men's play on. I just I don't know if Shaq was obviously I don't think Shaq was trying to offend Candace Parker,
Mhm.
but it still was offensive.
Yeah.
Like the question is offensive. That's like asking me. why is your skin so do you think your life would be a little bit easier if your skin was lighter? I'm just being curious. I mean, you're not I mean, I'm still kind of offended that you felt like you needed to ask me that. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Um, so I
There's a
just
lack of, like, awareness, I
yeah,
think,
like,
that
come
it's a
on, man.
total lack of awareness, and you're
Yeah,
like,
like,
"Really,
come on,
dude?"
like, again, read the room.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Read the
like,
room.
"Really?" And, yeah, so that unfolded, that was an interesting kind of highlight in the midst of all of this March madness, and we were like, "Alright, Shaq."
Actually, I think the most that was disrespectful, but I actually think the most disrespectful thing I heard or seen recently
Mhm.
was after the imagery went viral of the NCAA women's tournament. There was a comment that Nick Young, also known
Ah,
as Swaggy P,
yes.
and pretty much like the justification for the lack of resources was because the women's game is the JV team.
I saw that, yeah.
Now that Shaq's comment question was stupid. Nick Young's comment was just flat out just disrespectful,
I mean, could we call it sexist?
sexist,
Yeah, like,
disrespectful.
just
Like, come on now.
come on
And
now.
I'm not really lost for words, but it's just like, why would you say that? Like,
Yeah.
it's just one of those things. Like, you just keep that to yourself. Like, if that's how you really feel, keep it to yourself. But stop. Like, why are we always trying to? I just don't understand. Like, why we be trying to act like the women's game or women's sports in general, like there's a like I could not go on like I may have played football at the highest level, and I will say I'll take myself as a football player over a lot of women that play football, more on a competitive level. But if I decided to go play tennis against Naomi Osaka or Serena Williams or Venus Williams, I'm getting my ass kicked. I'm not so like she's not a JV tennis player. She's a professional. If I try to play golf with a professional golfer, she's going to kick my ass. Why? Because
Mhm.
I'm not a professional golfer. I didn't go to college to play collegiate basketball. I'm going like I don't know why we be trying to act like, and I feel like my vernacular is getting a little lazy, but it's just because I'm so like impassioned about this. Is I just don't understand. I don't understand like why are we and maybe I have a different level of respect because at UConn, majority of my friends, male and female, were athletes.
Right.
All of them were athletes. You know what I'm saying? Ma- And because of that, we supported each other. I was going to men's and women's basketball games. I'm going to women's volleyball games. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to men's soccer, women's soccer. Like we were supportive of track. We're supportive of everybody because we just looked at them and we looked at each other as just athletes at this school. And maybe because we have a level of, relating to each other because we go through the same struggles of being student athletes every day. But at no point do you ever really think like she's a less of an athlete than I am when we both waking up for the same 6 a.m. live. We still
Mhm.
got to go to the same study hall, be at the same game. So Nick Young, like, it's just like, wow.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how people can hit send and be like, yeah, this was okay.
Right. And I think and I understand, like, where you're almost, like, not lost for words, but you are because I feel that same thing, and it's a part of, like, just fatigue. I'm like, "How many times have we had this conversation? And how many times are we gonna have to have it in the future because we still haven't figured it out?" And that's the thing with Nick Young, and he's not the only one. He might be a really high profile player, but you look at the comments that are on social media posts about female athletes, you see this stuff all the time from some dude sitting in his basement. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it gets frustrating because if you're saying it out loud, that means you think it's okay and you're not understanding what you're actually saying, right?
Yeah.
Like there are and that's where it comes down to this big, big concept, this big, big conversation that we always have to have when we talk about women's sports, right? At a certain level, we get down to, okay, we have systemic sexism
Yeah.
rooted in our cultural institutions, right? And this is how comments like Nick Young's happen, right? Because we are socialized into a culture that devalues women and devalues female athletes and associates women with being less capable, less athletic, less interesting, less et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And so at a certain point, we have to understand like we have to break that link. How
Yeah.
do we reframe these associations? How do
Yeah.
we look at it from a sociocultural perspective and say, okay, where is this phrase, like you run like a girl, you play back like you whatever like a girl, right? Like that classic like playground insult. Okay, what does that actually mean? Because all of what's happened with March Madness and Shaq's comment and Nick Young, all of that happening comes down to this idea that we have rooted in our culture that women are less good
Yeah.
and than men, right? And
Yeah.
it gets frustrating. That's a really hard conversation to have, and it's so big
Yeah.
and it's so nebulous, and it's like, okay, what do we do about it?
I mean, you gotta all I could really say is we gotta just keep fighting the fight. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I really there's no I can't say like flip of the switch solution
Right.
because as you can see from the events that have happened, like we are still in like this fight for change, in a lot of different areas between uh, racism against black people, racism against Asian people, sexism in sports. Like there are all these fights that still exist and we still got to keep fighting. And to answer your question about like just men versus women, like we live in this society where we grow up and think like women are naturally soft. Like, well, think about when we're
Right.
kids. Think about when we're kids. And I think this actually is something that ultimately kind of negative impacts young men and young women. In society, we live in this world where if a boy and a girl are on the ground, they're both crying. We live in a society where we'll pick the girl up and coddle her and tell her it's okay and it's okay to cry and let it out. But a boy is like, why are you crying? Toughen up. This and that. You got to be this way. You got to be macho. You got to look and present yourself in these ways. And these little discrepancies in our development carry on as we get older. But it also, these like stereotypes of how we should be treated systemically are also rooted in how we are governed in other entities like NCAA and in business, in your field of profession, in school, all in overall real world scenarios. Like there these
Mhm.
little structures that we go through in our development that we see them later, like in the NCAA. I mean, we feel like the men, because they feel a certain way, they need a bit more because they gotta look a certain way. It gotta be a certain appeal. The women, there's soft. They don't need as much. It's not that big of a deal. It's just the women's tournament. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
It's that attitude. Um, and these are the issues, like these are those discrepancies that are just so deeply rooted that we got to keep going through back and forth. And the only way we can solve them is we got to keep combating them, I guess.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any real solution, but just keep going. You got to just keep being loud. I think the louder you are, the more people listen and the more people want to change. So you just can't stop. I think once you stop, complacency, silence is almost like just as bad as if you were the one marginalized or oppressing someone.
Yeah. And I think as we wind down this episode, I mean, that's a great thing to keep in mind and remember. And another thing is what we're seeing with March Madness that happens on a small scale in our communities and our experiences as well. What we're seeing here is reflected in our own lives. And so be conscious of your community, right? What's happening in the world around you and what can you do on a small level, right? Just in your everyday life to make sure that we aren't perpetuating, right, systemic sexism or systemic racism for that matter, or systemic homophobia, right? All of these little things. There's a level of control that we do have, and especially in the face of something like the NCAA, it might not feel like it because they are so big, but in our everyday lives, in our personal lives, in our communities, and our family, we have the power to enact change on a small scale. And so don't forget that you have the ability to generate real actionable change just by existing.
Yeah. And don't be afraid either. I mean, I know it could be scary feeling like speaking out. But as somebody who has, led marches, walked in protests, has seen it all, you know, it could be a bit scary sometimes and it could be a bit overwhelming. But I mean, you gotta fight for something, you know? Sometimes it's
Mhm,
just not even it's just about like just the overall better good, the greater good. You know what I'm saying? And even if you're afraid, you kind of just gotta throw some dirt on it, I guess. And you gotta throw some dirt on it and just, wrong is wrong and stand up for that. You know what I'm
right.
saying?
And we're
Silence
standing
or
with you.
right. I just feel like, listen, when you're silent, if you know something is wrong and you're silent about it, you should feel just as guilty as those who are doing it wrong. Because that
Mhm,
means you're willing to turn a blind eye to something that is negatively or possibly negatively affecting other people.
mhm.
Um, but on a more upbeat note, I just want to say my prediction for the 2021
Oh, yeah.
NCAA Women's March Madness Tournament is drumroll please. By no no surprise at all, the University of Connecticut Huskies. I think Geno Auriemma and company, Paige Beckers, Aaliyah Edwards, Squeaks, Ono and company, they're going to get it done for another year. Go Huskies. Um, cheers to another tournament. Another tournament trophy. I'm calling it.
You're calling it. Well, I hope you didn't just jinx them, but they were my pick too. As we watch them just totally crash and burn, I hope not. Um, if you want to get in touch with us, feel free to shoot us an email at inlinkpod@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram at shescores.ca and all of our personal contact info and where you can find She Scores and again where you can find resources. That will all be listed in the description box of the episode.
Till next time. Bye,
All
Cat.
right. Thank you. See you later.